Dr. Todd Curtis, good morning. How are you, my man?
Good morning to you. Doing just fine.
All right. Now, a lot of speculation, of course, about this Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, and it seems like every day the prevailing theory about what happened to this plane changes because of little drips of information that come out from Malaysia. First of all, would you say that Malaysia has totally bungled and botched this investigation from the get-go?
I would say that Malaysia has faced a challenge that rarely has been faced, even by the United States. You have an aircraft that's literally missing. It's about 10 or 12 days now. In recent jet history, this hasn't happened. Even aircraft that have been lost for a few days, there was some idea of where it was, and it was found within a week. They also haven't had to deal with the internet reality we have now. You go online, go on Twitter, literally there are hundreds of tweets per minute at all hours of the day and night. People around the world are very, very focused on this. And Malaysia, it's a competent government, but they're just being overwhelmed by the kind of effort they have to have on this.
Do you think they have the technical expertise to do this, or are they going to need the United States or someone else to help them out?
They don't, and that's typical of most countries. The technical expertise that's needed to do a thorough investigation exists only in a handful of countries. Those are the countries that have been involved very heavily in development of commercial airliners for the last several decades. We're talking the U.S., Western Europe, Canada, Australia, and typically a situation like this happens. A lot of technical expertise comes from the outside.
Now, a lot of focus has been on these transponders, and I'm a layman, so I guess what these transponders do, if you're on radar, basically, if you don't have your transponder on, you just show up as a blip. There's no information, really. It just goes, there's something out there. The transponders somehow communicate with the radar or ground control and signal back to that ground station. Okay, this is what I am. I'm a Boeing 777. I'm this flight number. I am at this altitude, and maybe some other details. I don't know. But that's essentially accurate, correct?
That's correct. The transponder responds whenever it hears a coded signal from a radar.
Okay.
It doesn't just kind of, transmit continuously. It hears something from radar, it shoots something back.
Gotcha. Now, apparently these were both turned off. There's two transponders on the plane, both turned off. This raises a question, and you were an engineer for Boeing. Why can you even turn these transponders off? I've heard explanations. Well, when we're on the ground, we don't want to clutter up radar. And Dr. Curtis, I would say that my car can turn the headlights on and off automatically, the windshield wipers on and off automatically. Why don't planes turn the transponders off and on automatically? When they're on the ground, it's off. When they're in the air, they're on, and you can't manually turn these off.
Well, there are a couple of very practical reasons for that. One of those you actually mentioned. If you're on the ground, it might be useful for air traffic control to not have that signal coming off if you're not flying. But more importantly, if you're flying in an aircraft, or for that matter, driving down the road in a car, and you have some electrical device that's overheating and catching on fire, you'd like to have the opportunity to turn it off so that it doesn't cause any further problems. So if for no other reason, for that safety reason, the crews have to have the ability to shut down electrical devices like a transponder if it's either giving them bad information or, more importantly, if it's causing a hazard that could take down the whole airplane.
Speaking of electrical fires, that now has a pilot wrote that he believes, a blog, that he believes that is what brought this plane down. And that sort of came back to the forefront of theories yesterday or the day before that maybe it was an electrical fire. The crew diverted. They tried to turn around, and then they were overcome by smoke, and the plane just continued flying on for 7 or 8 hours. Now, I don't know. It appears to have made perhaps some other course changes during that time. I don't know how that would have been possible if the crew was incapacitated or dead. How much credence do you give to that theory that this was some sort of fire or electrical fire on this plane?
Well, that theory of what happened, that sequence of events, is certainly plausible, and it's something that's happened more than one time in the history of aviation. But having worked in the field for a while, and for about 9 years I was at Boeing as a safety engineer, and one of my responsibilities, along with the others in the department, was to review literally thousands of incidents and accidents, looking for patterns, doing statistical analyses on them, looking for the kinds of insights into how complex systems fail, especially like with an airplane. You have multiple complex systems working all the time together. And although I don't look at any particular specific theory, what I have done is, given the data that's out there for this particular event, basically broken it down into 4 different categories of what might have happened. And there are a lot of theories that can go into any one of those categories. My first category is a traditional hijacking. That is, someone who's not on the inside takes over the airplane.
Mm-hmm.
The second one is a hijacking that is either completely by the cabin crew or cockpit crew, or there's complicity between passengers and the crew.
Mm-hmm.
The third category, which is what this pilot's blog would fall under, would be the flight crew responding to an extraordinary set of circumstances, system failures that are happening in multiple places in the aircraft, where the crew does whatever it takes to keep the airplane flying. And if there is nothing in the way of a procedure that fits that situation, they'll have to exercise both initiative and creativity to do whatever is necessary to keep flying the airplane, to navigate that airplane to someplace safe. And only after those responsibilities are done, they may communicate with the outside world. And the fourth possibility, this sort of also encompasses parts of this other pilot's theory, in that you could have a situation where there was literally no input into the flight control system or the flight control computer. Let's say the pilots were overcome by smoke or were compelled not to touch the controls by hijackers. It doesn't really matter. The aircraft is actually designed so that in some flight modes, it will continue to fly and keep a level flight by its own means.
Mm-hmm.
And if you had it dialed in to go due south and you made no further controls, the airplane might keep flying due south until it ran out of fuel.
I saw on CNN all day yesterday, Dr. Curtis, a new theory that's gaining a foothold on the internet that the plane was somehow hacked and that this is a cyber hijacking and that someone hacked in and took over the controls of the aircraft. Now, you probably know better than anyone, having worked for Boeing. To me, this seems completely implausible. Is that a possibility that let's say, all of the technology that the United States has, and with the NSA, we know that all of the stuff, the monitoring that they've done, all of the agencies of the United States that we have, and spy agencies and that sort of stuff. If we wanted to take over an aircraft remotely, would even the whole government of the United States be able to do that, let alone a 15-year-old teenager in Malaysia or Al Qaeda or someone like that?
Well, let me answer that in 2 or 3 different pieces. First, the airplane, and when I was at Boeing, I was part of the 777 design team, one of thousands of engineers, and I had a very tiny role in all this, primarily looking at the safety aspects of it. When this aircraft was designed, it was actually conceptually designed in the 80s. It started being built in the 90s, and of course went into service in the mid-90s. The internet and computer systems that we have today were nowhere near that complicated back in 1995.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't have iPhones. You didn't have the level of sophistication that the average consumer or the average hacker has access to. But at the same time, the aircraft was designed so that the flight control computer, the software for that, there was no real direct way to access it via the internet. In fact, the internet back in the early 90s was a shadow of itself. Now, that said, 20 years on, there's a lot more sophistication out there. It's conceivable that it could have been hacked, but not by some 15-year-old with some off-the-shelf computer. It would have to be, like you said, something on the order of a government, the NSA, getting in league with the actual designers of the flight control system, putting in software years before to put a backdoor sort of thing in there so that somehow or another it could be remotely controlled to some extent. It's possible, but I always ask this question for aviation incidents. One of my basic questions is, okay, you give me a theory, great. Has it ever happened before? It's a yes/no question. If it's yes, great. Give me some examples. Let's look at a case study. If the answer is no, I have a much, much higher standard of proof that you have to show me before I believe it's possible. And I think this is one of those cases. Nice sounding theory. I've never heard of it happening before. Show me specifically how it could be done.
Do you think that after 9/11, where that obviously changed our outlook on aviation security, do you think that after, and I just thought of this because what you were saying, this back door that a government could go to manufacturers or whoever and request, hey, put a back. I mean, they've done that with internet companies, with saying, "Hey, allow us access into your systems." Is it possible that Boeing, who you used to work for, could have, the government could have contacted Boeing and they said, look, if there's ever a hijack scenario, again, we want to be able to control your plane remotely via satellite, and only we would have the ability to do that in extreme emergencies. How do you think Boeing would respond to something like that?
Well, Boeing might respond in several ways. One of those ways is an engineering way. That is, the system is designed, 777, 787, and even earlier than that. The system is designed so that the pilot actually has some leeway and some control to take over manual control of the aircraft. That is, you can disengage systems, you can turn off radios. There's a lot of things you can do to reconfigure the airplane to fly it. And I suspect that if you have a pair of pilots who are suddenly seeing the flight control system acting in ways that just make no sense whatsoever, that they'll do what's necessary, pulling circuit breakers, turning off switches, to isolate whatever systems were necessary to isolate to get control of the airplane. So unless you have a physical person manually controlling the airplane in the cockpit who intends to do something with it, I think that even if you had full control over what the flight control system could do, what the computers could do on the aircraft, that the crew could circumvent those and keep flying.
I know there's been a lot of attention paid to this ACARS system. That, my understanding, is basically communication. I don't know if it's via satellite or if I guess it's via satellite.
It's a variety. I mean, satellite is one of them.
And basically, this relays data about the plane back to somewhere. I don't know who, back to the airline or to the manufacturer, or maybe both. And it basically, probably in small chunks of data, says, okay, over the last however many minutes or half hour, whatever, here are events that have taken place on this aircraft. Is that safe to say?
That's in general a correct description of it. It's a system that's not required for use on aircraft, but it's one that manufacturers and airlines have found incredibly useful for a bunch of reasons. One of them is you can get data from engine and aircraft performance, compile this data from hundreds or even thousands of aircraft, build up a picture of how the aircraft fleet is performing, and actually make changes to the design and procedures over time to make it more efficient. And ACARS is a very flexible system. You can also do, for example, text messaging type communication between the air and the ground. And it's all depending on what the airline would like to contract for, because there's various options that it has. Some people have the gold-plated system that has all kinds of information back and forth. Malaysia had a fairly sophisticated system, which allowed them to do many things. So sophisticated, in fact, that when whoever tried to shut the system down, or tried to shut it down, they didn't shut it completely down. That is, they may have shut down the data portion of it, but they didn't depower it entirely, because you had a very basic, like a cell phone handshake sort of signal, a basic beep that goes out every once in a while that tells the neighboring cell phone system, I'm a cell phone, I'm alive, if you need to call me, go through this tower, sort of thing. So, again, even though...
Is there any way... You bring up my next question, Dr. Curtis. Is there any way that system could have been disabled and still remained, as you said, alive to these pings, which is how we sort of have an idea of where this plane was at a certain time, 8:11 in the morning or whatever. It was still pinging, which is long after the flight had disappeared. It was still communicating with that satellite, saying, "Okay, I'm here. I'm not transmitting any data, but I'm here." Is there any mechanical or fire or fault or could you foresee a possibility where that would occur, where that satellite uplink availability would still be there, but it wouldn't be transmitting anything? Does that seem more to you? You're familiar with the system, that someone attempted to disable in order to hide the plane, this ACARS system, or that it was some sort of a mechanical failure that affected part of it but not all of it?
Well, without having access to the aircraft and any data on the aircraft, and of course the physical remains of it, whether it's intact or not, it's hard to say how it happened. The only thing that's clear is that you had a system that was fully operational, and at some point it only had a very basic operation left over. Whether that was part of some sort of system failure within ACARS, some sort of wider system failures within the aircraft, But whether it was due to deliberate human action, that remains to be seen. But the fact is, we have very clear evidence that it was fully working at one point, and afterwards it wasn't.
Some people have pointed to this Air France flight that went down in the ocean, and ACARS, or maybe it wasn't Air France, but another flight that ACARS would send if there was an emergency, if there was a fire on the plane or something. Would ACARS, prior to being disabled, I mean, in an instant, would that send data that says, hey, there's something going on here wrong with this plane? If there was an emergency situation, does ACARS relay something back that we would have gotten prior to ACARS being terminated for whatever reason?
Well, I can't speak to that because I don't know the particular installation of ACARS either in the Malaysian aircraft or in the one you mentioned, which was an Air France A330 back in 2009. But in that event, by the way, the A330, similar in size, similar in technology to the 777, so there may be a lot of analogies here. The ACARS was sending a stream of mostly maintenance-related data, and although there was not an emergency signal coded into that, there was information that came through when once the engineers looked at it. They saw there were some unusual readings coming out right before the end. And as it turns out, those unusual readings were due, in fact, to some issues that were going on with the airplane. But as far as that Air France flight was concerned, a little bit of history, it went missing over the Atlantic. There was some general idea of where the airplane went down, an area that was maybe, 1,000th or smaller, one-thousandth the size or smaller of the search area that's being done now. And it still took searchers with ships and planes 5 days to find any debris on the surface of the ocean. So, yes, ACARS was useful indirectly for locating the aircraft and for diagnosing what went on. But it still was not enough to quickly find the airplane. And in the case here with Malaysia, we have even less information. And it's orders of magnitude more difficult to find this aircraft.
Dr. Todd Curtis is on with us. He's a safety engineer, former safety engineer for Boeing, and an expert on this kind of stuff. We only have you for another minute or so. Let me quickly go to Brian in Rochester, who has a question for Dr. Curtis. Go ahead, Brian.
Yes, I've been reading Unbroken, which features an airplane crash in the water and men surviving out on a raft. I'm kind of wondering what sort of provisions, rafts, food supplies, radio transponders would this have, and what are the odds we could have people surviving on rafts for weeks, months, at a time?
Yeah, if this thing went down in the ocean, Dr. Curtis, what's the survivability? What's available to people?
Well, that's a very good question. I don't know the specific layout of this aircraft, but typically an aircraft of that size would have several life rafts on board, and those life rafts would have a radio beacon of some kind. The fact that these beacons have not been picked up by satellites or ships or planes says to me that either the life rafts were not deployed or they were deployed and the beacons aren't working. But the other part of the question, what sort of provisions are on board? Minimal provisions. The idea is that if there's an emergency water landing and you have people in the water, that within hours you'll have ships, planes, or other rescue personnel on the scene. It's been over 10 days now, and even under the best of circumstances, assuming there was a water landing, you would have people in an open raft for over a week, really no food or water other than what might be floating on the surface of what they might catch. So survivability at this point would be a rather slim possibility.
Dieter, you wanted, before Dr. Curtis goes, you wanted to run your theory or theories by him quickly. Go ahead, Dieter.
Russia shot it down as a distraction for the Crimea takeover Ukraine. What about that?
Is that possible, Dr. Curtis?
Well, again, anything is possible. And in fact, the former Soviet Union was involved in 2 shoot-downs of airliners in the 1980s. But there's a couple of things that would argue against that theory. First, at no point was the aircraft thought to be over Russian territory. And second, there is no real heavy defensive situations in the parts where it was flying, where it was like the Cold War, where you had folks on hair trigger alert, interceptors on standby all the time. That sort of setup simply isn't happening in that part of Asia, even though there is conflict and such. It's not the same like it was in the 80s.
Yeah, and in fact, the United States has shot down airliners. We shot down an Iranian flight from a ship,
That's right.
surface-to-air missile. So these things have happened. But again, like Dr. Curtis says, you were on the brink, or there was a lot of tension. It wasn't just some random flight that was occurring. Possibility, Dr. Curtis, that this plane could have landed somewhere and someone's hiding it.
They put a bomb on it. You could bomb Israel.
Yeah, is that possible?
Well, let me hit both of those very quickly. As far as the airplane blowing up in the sky, there's actually quite a few assets the U.S. has, again, from the Cold War, that detects flashes and heat signatures in the atmosphere, and that in the past have detected things like the explosion of Flight 800 off Long Island.
Mm-hmm.
That system apparently has not picked up anything in that part of the world that is consistent with a fireball in the air, a plane being blown up, that sort of thing. That's one. Second, some third party, be it a nation-state actor like Iran or being some other national group like a terrorist group putting a bomb on board, again, there's possibilities where a plane can be destroyed where you don't have a fireball. But so far, with all the intelligence that's been put on this situation, there's no group or individual that has been identified. There's no group or individual that has come forward to make any kind of claims. The idea that this is some sort of sabotage event, very low probability, unless we have some very creative, very sick individual who talked to no one and just decided to do something. But again, there's no evidence to back that up, so I'll put that theory on the side for now.
All right. Dr. Todd Curtis has been on with us. His website is airsafe.com. He's a former safety engineer for Boeing. He specialized in accident investigation and safety research and analysis in the 777 engineering development. Listen, this has all been very helpful, Dr. Curtis. I'd love to have you on again sometime because I'm fascinated with this story. I can't get enough of it. I'm assuming you, it's just your field of work, that you are fascinated with this as well.
Absolutely, for a bunch of reasons. And again, we're seeing something unfolding here as far as the public's response to it that I really haven't seen before. So all of us are learning something from this.
All right. Dr. Curtis, I appreciate you coming on. Thank you very much.